Last month, I was grabbing a coffee near a major corporate hub in Tokyo around 10 p.m. I noticed a man at the corner table, his tie loosened, staring intensely at a massive spreadsheet. He wasn't analyzing market trends or projected profits. Instead, he was painstakingly cross-referencing 3 different sets of meeting minutes to create a single Ringi document, a formal proposal that required 17 different physical stamps of approval. He looked exhausted, but there was a flicker of almost religious devotion in his eyes. When I asked him why this couldn't wait until morning, he told me with total sincerity that the visible effort was the only way to ensure the consensus held. To him, the hours weren't the cost. They were the proof of commitment. It was a perfect snapshot of the Japan paradox, the longest hours in the developed world paired with the lowest productivity. For 30 years, the global narrative has been that this is a cultural curse, a terminal case of presenteeism that no government Premium Friday campaign could ever fix. We viewed it as a society trapped by its own work ethic. But then, I saw something that felt like a glitch in the matrix. The man opened a generative AI window, pasted a messy transcript of a 4-hour board meeting, and watched as the tool restructured the entire document into a perfect formal draft in under 30 seconds. The transition was instantaneous. The man who just defended the sanctity of the long grind didn't look offended or like he was cheating. He looked relieved. He closed his laptop, finished his coffee, and walked toward the station well before the last train. That moment, that sudden collapse of a decades-old documentation trap, is why the world is currently misreading what's happening in East Asia. For years, the gap between Japanese input and output was a structural nightmare that no human could work their way out of. But now, AI is targeting the exact bottlenecks, the meetings, the reports, the endless approval chains that define Japanese work life. The very country we wrote off as too traditional or stuck in the fax machine era is about to prove that when you give the world's most disciplined workforce the ultimate shortcut, the productivity paradox doesn't just fade, it shatters.
To really understand the sheer physical weight of this transformation, you have to look past the macroeconomic statistics, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You need to examine the daily granular reality of the people who have been trapped inside this system for their entire professional lives. If you want to grasp how AI is rewiring a national economy, you have to start with the lived experience of someone like Sato-san.
Right.
He's a 45-year-old middle manager at a Tier 2 automotive supplier in Nagoya.
Nagoya, right. That's essentially the industrial heartland of Japan, where the pressure to maintain flawless operational records is absolute.
And for 15 years, Sato-san has existed inside what is universally known in Japanese corporate culture as the Jijiroku trap.
The Jijiroku trap.
Yeah, if you look up Jijiroku in a dictionary, it translates simply to meeting minutes.
Just meeting minutes. That sounds pretty standard.
Right, but in the context of a Japanese enterprise, that translation completely fails to capture the gravity of the document. Jijiroku is this demanding, high-stakes institutional requirement. I mean, for Sato-san, creating this document meant his Tuesdays regularly ended at midnight.
Wow. And, if you were picturing a man working until midnight, you might assume he's pushing toward a massive product launch or coding a breakthrough piece of software.
Sure. Or analyzing competitor data to pivot the company's strategy.
Exactly. But that isn't what was happening here. He was sitting under the harsh, humming fluorescent lights of an otherwise empty office, bathed entirely in the blue light of his monitor. You could look at him and see the physical toll.
Yeah, it's visceral.
The loss of skin elasticity under his eyes, the subtle, involuntary trembling in his hands as his fingers hovered over the keyboard. And all of this physical anxiety was generated by the sheer terror of trying to transcribe the circular, polite, and highly ambiguous deliberations of his superiors into an immutable corporate record.
That trembling in his hands is the key detail, because that physical anxiety is deeply rooted in the linguistic and cultural mechanics of the Japanese corporate meeting.
It's not just taking notes.
Exactly. Creating the Jijiroku is not mere stenography. You aren't just typing what people say. It is an intricate, exhausting act of high-stakes translation.
Let's break down exactly why that translation is so difficult. Why can't you just write down the words that were spoken in the room?
Because in high-context Japanese corporate speech, a senior director rarely issues a direct binary command. You will almost never hear a department head say, I disagree with this plan, cancel it.
Right, that would be too confrontational.
Exactly. Instead, communication relies heavily on reading the atmosphere. It's a cultural concept known as kuki wo yomu, which literally translates to reading the air.
Reading the air. So you are expected to interpret the silence just as much as the words.
More than the words, often. A superior might respond to a proposal from a junior executive with a prolonged inhalation of breath through their teeth.
Oh, the teeth-sucking sound.
Yeah, that exact sound. Accompanied by a very slight tilt of the head and a phrase that literally translates to, it is somewhat difficult, but we will consider it.
Okay, now, in a low-context Western business environment, we will consider it means exactly that. The proposal is under review.
Right, but in the Japanese boardroom, that specific combination of a sharp breath, a tilted head, and that exact phrase is a definitive, uncompromising no.
Wait, so the burden falls entirely on the middle manager, someone like Soto-san, to take that subtle atmospheric no and formally record it in the minutes without actually writing the word no.
Exactly. He must translate that profound ambiguity into a definitive, formal corporate record that honors the politeness of the room while establishing the factual outcome of the meeting. The trembling in Soto-san's hands stems from the intense fear of getting this translation wrong.
Because the stakes are huge.
They really are. If he misinterprets a senior director's polite, maybe as a formal yes, or if he fails to accurately capture the subtle, unspoken hierarchy of objections raised during a grueling 4-hour session, the consequences are severe.
Because the Jijiroku isn't just a recap email. It becomes the foundational truth for all subsequent corporate action. If you get it wrong, you haven't just made a clerical error. You have committed a severe breach of the institutional consensus. You've essentially rewritten reality.
Right. You have disrupted the harmony of the organization by failing to accurately reflect the invisible social web.
If you think about it in software terms, Sato-san was functioning as a human API.
Oh, a human API.
Yeah, an application programming interface. In computing, an API is the middleware that allows two completely different systems to talk to each other. It takes a request from System A, translates it into a rigid format that System B can understand, and then delivers it. Sato-san was the exhausted middleware. He was taking the unstructured, highly nuanced, context-heavy emotional input of human executives, which is System A, and agonizingly reformatting it into the highly structured, objective, immutable ledger of the corporation. System B.
That is a brilliant analogy because APIs require massive amounts of processing power to run continuously. The administrative burden placed on Sato-san was never just a productivity metric on a spreadsheet. It was a physical weight. It was a human life spent acting as a transcription device for a hierarchy that generated endless amounts of verbal data.
But then, a fundamental shift occurred. Sato-san's department integrated an AI-driven meeting summarizer. And this is where you have to look closely at what actually happens when artificial intelligence intersects with structural inefficiency.
Because it wasn't just an upgrade.
No, this integration wasn't framed as an efficiency upgrade. It wasn't a simple software patch. For Sato-san, it was a life-altering event.
The mechanism of this AI is fascinating. It ingested the raw audio and the messy transcribed text of these sprawling, ambiguous meetings, and it successfully decoded the corporate speech that had drained Sato-san for a decade.
The transition was abrupt, wasn't it?
Completely abrupt. For the first time in 10 years, Sato-san arrived home in Nagoya early enough to see his daughter's face before she fell asleep. The AI dismantled his entire professional burden in a matter of seconds.
I need to stop you there because this is the exact point where the promise of AI usually hits a wall of reality.
So?
Well, we just spent 10 minutes establishing that Japanese executive communication relies on omitted subjects, extreme politeness levels, and nonverbal cues like sucking air through your teeth. How can an algorithm, a piece of software, possibly read the room? It feels like relying on an LLM to navigate Kuki-wo-yomu would lead to catastrophic misinterpretations. Like, if an AI misreads that polite no as a yes, doesn't that blow up the whole company?
That is the natural assumption, yeah. But it misunderstands how these specific AI architectures are being deployed. We are not talking about generic, off-the-shelf translation models trained on random internet data here. The AI agents being integrated into these environments, particularly those developed by domestic Japanese tech entities like Rakuten or, specialized enterprise software providers, are built on large language models fine-tuned specifically for Japanese corporate linguistics.
So they aren't just learning Japanese, they're learning salaryman Japanese.
Exactly. But more importantly, you have to look at how an LLM processes language. An LLM tokenizes words and maps them into a massive multidimensional vector space.
Right. The math behind the words.
Yes. It doesn't need to feel the tension in the room or literally hear the sharp intake of breath. What it does is recognize the established, probabilistic syntactic patterns of polite refusal versus conditional approval.
Can you explain that vector space concept a bit more? How does the AI know the difference without the human intuition?
Think of it this way. When human executives speak in these meetings, they use highly specific phrasing when they are avoiding a direct answer. The AI's neural network has analyzed millions of past transcripts, literally millions. It maps out the statistical probability that a phrase like, "we will consider it carefully," when spoken by a senior director to a junior manager at the 2-hour mark of a meeting, historically results in the project being abandoned. The AI is recognizing mathematical patterns in the syntax that correlate with specific corporate outcomes.
So the AI isn't trying to be a psychologist, it's playing the ultimate game of pattern recognition. And it has a cheat code, doesn't it? Because the Jijiroku documents themselves are incredibly rigid.
That is the cheat code. While the human speech in the boardroom is completely ambiguous, the underlying structure of the final Jijiroku document is highly predictable. And remember, Japanese corporations have been maniacally recording these Jijiroku documents perfectly for decades.
So there is an immaculate, massive training data set already sitting on the company servers.
The AI learns exactly how previous instances of vague corporate speech were ultimately recorded in the formal minutes by human managers. It trains on Sato-san's past suffering. And the scale of this is staggering when you connect it to the bigger picture. Japanese organizations structurally require these massive meeting loads. Senior project managers spend 40 to 50% of their working hours in mandatory consensus-building meetings.
Half their life is just sitting in a room trying to achieve harmony.
Yes. It is a systemic requirement. But because AI can now perfectly map the vector space of that harmony, the adoption of AI to handle the resulting documentation has surged from 11% to 75% in just 5 years.
75%, that's a massive jump.
We are seeing major companies document savings of up to 60,000 work hours annually just on minutes and emails. The AI is successfully carrying the exact cognitive load that previously crushed the middle management tier.
Okay, so if the AI is suddenly doing the heavy lifting of summarizing the meetings, what happens to the decisions that are actually made in those meetings? Because summarizing a decision is one thing. Getting that decision officially approved by a Japanese corporation is an entirely different nightmare.
You are talking about the transition from the Jijiroku to the Ringi.
If you want to understand this, you have to immerse yourself in the reality of a traditional trading house in Osaka.
Right.
Think about the life of Kenji, a junior associate in one of these firms. Kenji's daily reality wasn't defined by meetings. It was defined by the physical pursuit of the Ringisho.
And the Ringisho is the physical embodiment of corporate consensus. It is a circular proposal document.
And when we say circular, we don't mean an email thread. We mean a literal physical folder that must be carried by hand.
Hand-delivered to every desk.
Right. This document demands a literal trail of red ink Hanko stamps from dozens of different departments before the company will authorize even the smallest action. Kenji spent a quarter of his entire working week literally walking from desk to desk, department to department, carrying this folder.
And the psychological toll of that walk is immense.
You can visualize it. You can feel the visceral cold sweat of a junior employee when this critical document suddenly stalls on the desk of a stubborn department head.
And it always stalls.
Exactly. And the maddening part is that the document rarely stalls because the core business logic is flawed. The profit margins could be perfectly calculated. It stalls because the department head dislikes the font size. Or they question a specific phrasing on page 3.
Or, most commonly, they feel they weren't sufficiently consulted in private prior to the document's formal arrival on their desks.
That need for prior consultation is the invisible engine of the Ringi system. It is a practice known as Nemawashi.
Nemawashi. What is the literal translation of that?
It comes from gardening. It literally means going around the roots. When you are preparing to transplant a tree, you carefully dig around the root beforehand so the tree survives the move. Right. In a corporate setting, Nemawashi is the practice of informal, behind-the-scenes consensus building. You go to every single stakeholder privately, smooth over their ego, and ensure they agree with the proposal before the official document ever reaches their desk.
So the formal stamping of the Ringisho is really just theater. It's the ceremonial proof that you did the Nemawashi correctly.
Exactly. Historically, this system has been praised globally by management consultants. It is often cited as a superior method of maintaining organizational harmony. The logic is that, while it takes forever to get a decision made, once the final stamp is placed, implementation is seamless and instantaneous.
Because everyone in the company has already agreed.
Right. But the data paints a very different picture, doesn't it?
Because the operational cost of this harmony is catastrophic in the digital age. The data reveals that this exact process delays technology adoption and strategic corporate shifts by 40 to 60% compared to global peers in the US or Europe.
Because it functions exactly like a blockchain.
A blockchain?
The Ringi system is a paper-based blockchain. In cryptocurrency, a blockchain is a sequential, immutable ledger of approval. Node A must verify the transaction and cryptographically stamp it before Node B can receive the block. It requires an absolute network-wide consensus mechanism to move forward.
Wow, that is a very accurate structural comparison.
But unlike a digital blockchain, which operates at the speed of light through automated cryptographic hashes, the Ringi blockchain is entirely manual.
And painful.
Yes. It is deeply emotional, highly political, and agonizingly slow. Kenji, this junior associate in Osaka, is essentially the human computing power, the human GPU burning up his own energy trying to force the next block onto the chain by begging for a red ink stamp.
And he is fighting against a system that is fundamentally designed to diffuse risk. The Ringi system functions on the premise of shared responsibility.
Right. If everyone signs, no one is to blame.
By requiring 20 different people to stamp the document, no single individual bears the ultimate accountability if the proposal fails. If the project loses money, the CEO can look at the document and say, well, accounting, legal, HR, and sales all stamped it. We all share the blame.
It diffuses accountability so broadly that risk-taking becomes mathematically impossible. Every single node in that human blockchain has the power to veto, which means original aggressive proposals are continuously watered down, revised, and compromised until they reach the lowest common denominator of absolute, unoffensive acceptability.
But then, just like with Sato-san, the mechanism changed. Kenji's firm deployed an AI agent designed specifically to draft and route these Ringi proposals.
And this tool doesn't just scan a PDF and digitize the paper, right? Because that would just be creating a digital waiting room.
Exactly. No. This AI actually predicts potential friction points based on historical approval patterns.
Wait, how does it predict human friction?
By analyzing the metadata of past rejection.
Wild.
Right. The AI knows that the head of compliance always rejects proposals formatted without a specific risk matrix. It knows that the accounting director in node number 4 historically stalls any document that lacks a specific type of data visualization.
So it preempts the rejection.
The AI dynamically pre-optimizes the document for the specific psychological quirks and bureaucratic preferences of the exact approval chain it is about to face.
It is basically performing automated Nemawashi. It is smoothing the roots digitally.
And this triggered a profound, raw realization for Kenji. He suddenly saw the matrix for what it was. The sacred consensus of the Ringi system, which he had been taught from his first day as a graduate, was the bedrock of corporate harmony, was often just an elaborate mechanism for avoiding confrontation.
Because if the AI can navigate the personalities automatically, it proves that the resistance was never about the business logic in the first place.
Exactly.
It was just ego and procedure.
Exactly. But with the AI completely removing his role as the exhausted paper runner, the vulnerability in his professional life abruptly shifted.
He had to find a new way to be valuable.
Right. His new anxiety isn't about missing a stamp or facing down a grumpy manager. It is the terrifying new responsibility of actually having the free time to think.
That is a massive psychological pivot. If you are a traditional salaryman, you have measured your worth for decades by your endurance. Your value to the company was your ability to endure the cold sweats and navigate the labyrinth.
Right.
If the labyrinth is gone, you suddenly have to generate original ideas. You have to strategize.
It is a daunting paradigm shift. You are moving from a state of performing work to a state of producing value.
But let me challenge this shift, because we have to look at the cultural fallout. If AI completely removes the friction of the Ringi system, doesn't it also remove the organizational harmony and the shared responsibility that the system was originally designed to build? If nobody has to look each other in the eye and negotiate the roots of the tree, does eliminating the gauntlet effectively destroy the culture of the Japanese corporation?
Well, that assumes the friction was actively generating genuine harmony rather than just enforcing quiet compliance.
Okay, that's a sharp distinction.
The reality that Kenji uncovered is that much of that supposed harmony was an illusion maintained by sheer exhaustion. When a system requires a junior associate to endure cold sweats over font choices just to avoid offending a superior, That is not shared responsibility. That is structural intimidation masked as consensus.
Right. Nobody wants to fight back because they're too tired.
Exactly. The AI does not eliminate the need for agreement. It eliminates the performative suffering previously required to achieve it.
By predicting the friction points and optimizing the proposal, the AI forces the organization to evaluate the actual merit of the idea rather than the political capital of the person carrying the folder.
Exactly. It strips away the ceremonial aspects of the Ringi system, leaving only the functional core of decision-making. Now, this transition from performing work to producing value is a severe shock to the human system. But it is a necessary one because these micro-level frictions, the exhausted Sato-sans and the terrified Kenjis, were culminating in a macroeconomic disaster.
Which brings us to the macro precipice that Japan is currently standing on. If you want to understand why this AI adoption is happening so violently and so rapidly, you have to zoom out.
You have to see the big picture.
We have to connect the micro-level exhaustion to the massive structural nightmares threatening the entire economy. If every mid-level manager in the country is trapped doing manual translation and walking folders around a room, how does anything actually get done on a national scale?
It doesn't, or rather, it is reaching the point where it can't anymore. The most urgent manifestation of this is known in Japanese economic circles as the 2025 digital cliff.
The digital cliff. That sounds like a catastrophic systemic failure.
And this is not a vague think tank prediction. It is a very specific, quantified warning issued directly by the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, or MEDI.
Okay, what's the warning?
The calculation they ran is stark. Failure to modernize digital infrastructure and escape these legacy processes could cost Japan 12 trillion yen annually.
12 trillion yen. That is nearly $78 billion in economic loss every single year, starting in 2025. What exactly is driving that cliff? How do you lose $78 billion just from having bad software?
It is driven by the crushing burden of legacy systems. We are talking about highly customized, incredibly complex IT frameworks, often built on archaic programming languages like COBOL that were installed in the 1980s and 1990s.
Right, COBOL, the language that basically runs the back end of traditional banking and corporate finance, but that almost nobody under the age of 50 knows how to code anymore.
Exactly. And because these systems were custom built to accommodate the exact specificities of the Ringi system and the unique departmental structures of each company, they cannot be easily upgraded.
They're stuck.
There are black boxes. The engineers who built them have largely retired. As a result, these outdated frameworks consume 42% of corporate IT budgets.
42% of the budget is just going toward keeping the life support machines plugged in.
Companies are spending an average of nearly $40,000 annually just to maintain a single legacy system. And the human cost is worse. IT workers are losing an average of 17 hours a week simply performing manual patches, fighting system crashes, and keeping these ancient mainframes alive.
That is essentially technical debt reaching its absolute terminal velocity. They're spending all their capital repairing the hull of a sinking ship, and they have absolutely zero resources left to build a new engine. Meanwhile, Western counterparts are allocating vastly more of their IT budgets to cloud architecture, predictive analytics, and actual innovation.
That is the digital cliff, the moment when the cost of maintaining the past bankrupts the future.
But if you are listening to this, you have to ask a logical question. Why didn't Japan simply change these behaviors organically? If the government and the CEOs knew the digital cliff was coming, why did they need generative AI to force the issue?
Just mandate a change.
Right. Why couldn't the CEO of the Osaka trading house just send an email saying, effective tomorrow, we are reducing the Ringi stamps from 17 to 3, and we are moving to a cloud-based approval system?
Because the friction isn't just technological, it is deeply demographic. You cannot separate the software from the biological reality of the population. 30% of Japan's population is over the age of 65. Within the corporations themselves, 28% of the workforce is over 50.
The society is aging faster than any other developed nation on Earth.
And this creates massive, insurmountable friction for modernization. You are dealing with an entrenched demographic where surveys show that 62% of Japanese managers still actively prefer paper-based approvals. The cognitive plasticity required to abandon a 30-year habit of physically stamping a document is very low in that cohort.
And because of the seniority-based promotion system in Japan, those are the exact people who hold the veto power.
Correct. But the demographic crisis cuts both ways. Not only are the managers resistant to change, but the labor pool beneath them is shrinking rapidly.
Because nobody...
Exactly. Historically, if a Japanese company had an inefficient, bloated administrative process, they solved it by hiring an army of young graduates to absorb the pain. They threw human hours at the bottleneck.
But the young humans are no longer there.
The birth rate has collapsed. You cannot throw bodies at the problem anymore because the bodies do not exist.
And this demographic reality perfectly explains why decades of previous government and corporate interventions completely failed. For years, the global media watched Japan attempt to solve the productivity paradox, but they treated it as a behavioral issue, a lack of willpower.
Yes, they treated it as a psychological problem.
The government launched the infamous Premium Friday campaigns, urging workers to leave early at 3:00 p.m. on the last Friday of the month to go shopping and boost the economy. They instituted strict legal caps on monthly overtime. During the pandemic, they mandated work-from-home policies, but none of it worked.
Why do you think it failed so spectacularly?
Because they attempted to limit the hours worked without eliminating the structural documentation and approval requirements that consume those hours in the first place. You cannot solve a documentation overhead problem by simply telling people to go home.
Right.
If the CEO says, leave at 3:00 p.m., but the required Ringisho still legally needs 17 physical stamps before Monday morning, what happens?
The work doesn't vanish.
Exactly. The work doesn't vanish. The Jijiroku still needs to be transcribed flawlessly.
Yeah.
If you cap the overtime, the work simply moves into the shadows. Employees start taking the physical folders home secretly. They log out of the official timekeeping software and keep working on their laptops in cafes.
They're still doing the grind just off the books.
The system demanded a specific, rigid volume of output, and the traditional methods of production required massive human input. Until the actual mechanism of production changed, until AI could do the translation and the routing, the hours simply could not be reduced.
It is a profound lesson in systems theory. You cannot mandate behavioral change if the structural incentives remain identical.
Which presents the most jarring paradox of the modern industrial world. When you look at Japan from the outside, you see a nation of extreme technological contradiction. Well, how does a nation build the world's most sophisticated industrial robots? We are talking about companies like Fan-Yuk, achieving 99.2% accuracy in automated lights-out manufacturing. Japan houses 52% of the world's global industrial robot installations. They design robotic arms that can thread a needle in milliseconds.
True, they lead the world in that hardware.
And yet, simultaneously, that exact same society runs its corporate offices on fax machines, physical red ink stamps, and 20-year-old COBOL IT systems. How do you have absolute bleeding-edge, sci-fi optimization on the factory floor and total archaic stagnation in the white-collar office sitting right above it?
The divergence exists because the parameters of success are fundamentally different in those two environments. On the manufacturing floor, success is binary, objective, and highly quantifiable.
Speed, precision, defect reduction.
Exactly. Japanese engineering culture excels at optimizing for objective physical metrics. The philosophy of Kaizen, continuous incremental improvement, is incredibly easy to apply to a robotic assembly arm. You measure the cycle time, you tweak the algorithm, you save half a second. It is pure physics and math.
But the corporate office isn't governed by physics.
No. In the corporate office, success has historically been defined by social cohesion, error avoidance, and the maintenance of a highly complex vertical hierarchy. The Ringi system and the Jijiroku are optimized for these social parameters, not for speed.
So the inefficiency is actually a feature, not a bug.
Yes. The fax machine and the physical stamp persisted for so long because they provided tangible, physical proof of the social contract. They proved that the consensus process was respected. A digital signature feels ethereal. A red ink stamp stamped so hard it leaves an indentation in the paper is physical proof of commitment.
So the robotics optimize the physical world, and the paper processes optimize the social world. But the crisis emerged because the global digital economy accelerated, and optimizing the social world became far too slow to remain competitive. You can't spend 3 weeks optimizing social cohesion when a competitor in Silicon Valley is deploying a new product iteration every 3 days.
And the Japanese government finally recognized that the social optimization had become an existential threat.
Which perfectly sets up the systemic, top-down solutions that are currently enabling this AI revolution. Because AI didn't just organically seep into Japanese companies. The government took a sledgehammer to the regulatory environment to ensure it happened. If you look at the European Union right now, the EU AI Act is deeply restrictive. It is heavily focused on mitigating theoretical risk, protecting individual data privacy, and imposing incredibly stringent, punitive rules on developers who want to train models.
The EU approach is fundamentally precautionary.
Right. But Japan, staring down the barrel of the 2025 digital cliff and a collapsing demographic pyramid, took the exact opposite route. They enacted the AI Promotion Act, which is explicitly an innovation-first framework. There are virtually no stringent penalties designed to stifle adoption.
It's a completely different philosophy.
But the most aggressive move, the one that shocked the global tech community, is Japan's specific interpretation of copyright law.
This is perhaps the most consequential legal decision regarding AI in the world right now.
The Japanese government established a legal framework, specifically under Article 30-4 of their Copyright Act, that explicitly allows the use of third-party copyrighted works for the training of AI models, regardless of whether it's for commercial or non-commercial use.
It is a massive structural magnet for global AI developers.
Let's explain why that is such a big deal. When an AI company wants to build a large language model, they need to feed it billions of parameters of data. They scrape the internet. They scrape books, articles, images, and code.
And normally that causes huge legal problems.
Right. While tech companies in the US and Europe are currently bogged down in endless multi-billion-dollar class action legal battles with right holders, authors, and news outlets over whether this scraping constitutes theft, Japan has essentially stepped forward and declared its entire domestic data ecosystem open for machine learning.
And the cultural readiness perfectly matches this legislative aggression. You have to look at the psychology of the population.
Why are they okay with it?
An Ipsos survey recently revealed that the Japanese population is the least anxious about AI globally. Only 25% expressed any anxiety about AI entering the workplace, and only 1 in 10 believe AI will make the future worse.
That is a staggering contrast to the Western panic about AI taking everyone's jobs.
Yeah.
Where does that lack of fear come from?
It stems from 2 places. First, a deeply ingrained cultural history, partly rooted in Shinto animism, of viewing machines and objects as possessing a spirit, or at least being capable of harmonious partnership.
Oh, like pop culture reflects this, right? Think of Astro Boy or Doraemon.
Exactly. Robots are historically viewed as helpers, as extensions of human capability, rather than as dystopian terminators threatening humanity.
And the second reason is pure pragmatism, right?
It is born out of demographic necessity. When your population is shrinking by hundreds of thousands of people a year, you don't view a machine that can do the work of 3 people as a threat to your job. You view it as a desperate necessity to keep the lights on.
That makes total sense.
They view robots as partners because they literally do not have enough young people to run the hospitals, the factories, or the offices.
I understand the cultural pragmatism, but I have to push back heavily on the regulatory environment. Isn't opening up copyright law entirely for AI training a massive, incredibly dangerous gamble?
Well, it is aggressive.
Doesn't this innovation-first approach risk long-term legal and ethical chaos just to secure a short-term technological lead? If you tell AI companies they can scrape whatever they want, aren't you sacrificing the intellectual property rights of your artists, your writers, and your corporations on the altar of immediate productivity?
It is a profound gamble. There is no denying that. But it is a highly calculated risk when viewed against the alternative. The government in Tokyo is operating under the absolute mathematical certainty of the 2025 digital cliff.
So the cliff forces their hand.
Exactly. If they do not radically accelerate digital transformation, the economy will contract violently. The welfare state will collapse under the weight of the elderly.
So it's a triage situation.
Exactly. The macroeconomic damage of a shrinking workforce and stagnant productivity far outweighs the potential localized damage of domestic copyright disputes. Furthermore, the strategy is explicitly designed to attract frontier AI firms from abroad.
Like OpenAI.
Yes, look at OpenAI. They recently opened their first Asian office in Tokyo, explicitly to collaborate with domestic giants and the government.
Because Japan recognizes they are behind.
Yes. Japan missed the first wave of cloud computing and smartphone software. They recognize they are behind in foundational model development. So they are using their unique regulatory environment as a strategic asset to import the best technology in the world and then fine-tune it on their own Japanese corporate data.
They're importing the engine, but using their own fuel.
Exactly. The calculation is that the productivity gains from deploying these localized, highly capable AI agents will generate enough explosive economic growth to easily absorb any downstream legal friction. It is a survival mechanism. When your labor force is vanishing, prioritizing abstract intellectual property rights over the automation of your critical infrastructure is a luxury the state has decided it simply cannot afford.
And this builds directly to the ultimate revelation of this entire shift. This is the moment where the perspective entirely flips. It is the realization of how the very factors that crippled Japan's productivity for decades are right now, in real time, becoming its greatest asset.
This is the most fascinating part of all of this.
To truly grasp this, we have to ground the concept in the perspective of Ms. Tanaka. She is a policy analyst working in a cramped, paper-filled office overlooking the aging skyline of Shimbashi.
Shimbashi is historically known as the salaryman town of Tokyo. It is the symbolic heart of the traditional corporate grind.
Exactly. And for her entire career, Ms. Tanaka has lived with the historical national shame associated with being the hardest working but least productive nation in the OECD. She has watched the world mock the fax machines in the endless meetings.
The Japan paradox.
Right. But she recently presented a radical reframing of this entire situation. Her profound insight is that the immense waste of the Japanese system, the redundant layers of approval, the excessive painstaking documentation, the over-engineered politeness, the millions of hours spent transcribing the Jijiroku, the thousands of ringy folders walked across office floors, is not actually waste at all.
It's no waste.
No. In the age of AI, all of that historical friction is actually untapped data.
This is the turning point of the entire narrative. Japan's structured, rigid, and deeply consistent inefficiency serves as the absolute perfect blueprint for machine learning.
This requires a deep comparative analysis. Look at how a typical Western corporation operates today, a tech company in San Francisco or London. Their workflows are often chaotic, highly individualized, and deeply undocumented. Employees use ad hoc methods to solve problems.
They rely on informal Slack messages, unrecorded phone calls, hallway conversations, and idiosyncratic personal systems to get things done.
The Western philosophy is often move fast and break things. And when you do that, you don't leave a paper trail.
Right. So when you attempt to deploy an enterprise AI agent into that Western environment to automate workflows, the AI immediately struggles. It hits a wall of unstructured noise.
Because it doesn't know what's going on.
Exactly, because there is no consistent map of how decisions are actually made or how processes flow from department to department. The AI doesn't know who actually approves the budget because the official org chart doesn't match the reality of the messy Slack channels. The data is noisy, unstructured, and full of gaps.
Now compare that to the Japanese corporation. Every single decision, no matter how minute, no matter how trivial, has been explicitly documented, categorized, and physically mapped through the Ringi system for 50 years.
Yes.
Every single meeting has been transcribed into the precise, formal syntax of the Jijiroku format. Every workflow is rigidly defined, visual mapped out, and universally followed by every employee without deviation.
If we go back to the ELI-5 analogy.
Yeah, like a Western company is like a teenager's messy bedroom. An AI robot enters the room to clean it, but it has no idea where the socks belong or where the books go because there is no system. But a Japanese company is like a meticulously organized library where every single item has been perfectly labeled, categorized by the Dewey Decimal System, and placed in the exact same spot for decades. Japan is the ultimate efficiency laboratory precisely because it has been so stubbornly inefficient for so long. They have mapped their business processes with agonizing, obsessive precision.
And an AI large language model thrives on exactly this kind of structured, sequential, highly documented data. The algorithm can instantly map the exact path of a Ringisho approval because the humans have been walking that exact path without a single deviation, leaving a perfect paper trail for half a century.
It is an incredible, almost unbelievable inversion of reality, and the economic models are beginning to prove it. The SBI FAIR-I BP model projections quantify exactly what happens when you feed this structured, perfectly labeled data into these new AI tools.
We should explain what that model is because it is crucial. The SBI Financial and Economic Research Institute built a highly sophisticated macroeconomic model.
Right. They ran a high-resolution simulation of the entire Japanese economy, breaking it down and analyzing 828 different specific economic activities using input-output tables.
And the model projects that the acceleration of total factor productivity growth in Japan could jump from 0.5% to 1.1% annually.
That jump might sound small to a layperson, but in macroeconomic terms, doubling total factor productivity is a seismic event.
Let's explain total factor productivity, or TFP, because it isn't just about people working harder.
Yep.
If economic growth is like baking a cake, labor and capital are the ingredients, the flour and the eggs. If you want a bigger cake, you usually have to add more flour or more eggs.
Sure.
But TFP is the recipe. It is the X factor. It is how efficiently you combine the ingredients. If your TFP goes up, it means you are baking a much bigger, better cake using the exact same amount of ingredients.
And because Japan has no more labor to add, they're literally out of flour doubling. The efficiency of the recipe is their only hope for growth.
Exactly. This projected leap represents a staggering economic unlock. The model projects value-added increases of 257 trillion yen across the economy, with AI-related contributions making up more than half of that total.
What we are actually seeing on a macro level is that by finally automating the crushing white-collar bureaucracy, by freeing Sato-san and Kenji, the underlying world-class strength of Japanese manufacturing is finally able to pull the vast, historically stagnant service sector forward.
It's all connecting.
It is as if Japan spent the last 30 years unwittingly building the most highly organized, perfectly labeled training data set for an AI technology that didn't even exist yet.
The historical irony is absolute. The very mechanisms that prevented speed, the endless paper forms, the mandatory minutes, the physical stamps, created a digital architecture of perfect corporate visibility. The entire Japanese corporate ecosystem was essentially acting as a massive analog data labeling operation, formatting human interaction into strict syntactic structures.
They were doing the AI's homework before the AI was born.
Exactly. And now that the algorithms possess the computing power and the context windows to ingest those massive structures, the transition is completely frictionless. The AI does not have to guess how a Japanese company operates. The company has explicitly written it down in triplicate for 3 decades. The global narrative of Japan as a society trapped by its own archaic work ethic is completely dead.
It's entirely obsolete.
The sheer volume of bureaucratic friction that defined the Japan paradox is currently being converted into pure automated speed. The obsession with rigid process has inadvertently provided the perfect runway for algorithmic efficiency.
The very cultural rigidities the world viewed as fatal flaws have become the exact architecture required for absolute automation. Japan didn't lose 30 years, they were just preparing the data.